So I want to go ahead and transition to get a little bit into content to help ground this session out. And I wanted to try to connect it for why we put this session on the agenda right after the session that we just heard with Secretary King. And in preparing for this, I came across a report where Secretary King, I think, does it better than I ever could. And the report is a 2016 one from the US Department of Education that talks about the state of racial diversity in the educator workforce. And the foreword was written by Secretary King. Now, the report, of course, talks about the benefit for all students to have teachers of color, including the strong evidence that students of color benefit from having teachers and leaders who look like them and in role model roles, as well as the benefits for classroom dynamics that diversity creates. Sorry. Technical glitches includes throat tickles too. And then the report also talks about the benefits to our white students of having teacher of color in a leadership role in their classrooms and communities. And Secretary King poses a question for the nation. He says in the foreword, as he asks, how do we address increasing educator diversity quickly and thoughtfully? And I took that as a charge for this session to better understand how policy supports or hinders increasing educator diversity. And it's a topic of teacher preparation and teacher support that has been on state board agendas top of mind. There have actually been 466 agenda items just as of June dealing with the issue of teacher preparation and practice. And that can be about adjustments to the pandemic that we've seen in light of changes in staffing that schools and states are responding to as quickly as they possibly can. And that may be changes to substitute teacher certification requirements that we're seeing in states like Missouri or Illinois' work to help support first-year teachers who are experiencing their first year of teacher in a pandemic environment. But it also includes work like Kentucky, who have committed to furthering along educator diversity within their state, or Massachusetts is continuing work with a committee on their board to look at the issue of educator diversity, or states like Mississippi and Connecticut, who are setting goals for increasing educator diversity within their state. States are also looking at data about their teacher pipeline, demographics of students who are coming in, and where the barriers are in that pipeline to achieving an educator in that classroom that's an educator of color. I also want to say that the session will help unpack how state boards can leverage their authority under policy, their ability to convene stakeholders and educators and others, and their power to raise questions about how to increase teacher and school leader diversity. Because as the Secretary's report states, the majority of our public school students are students of color, but only a small proportion of our teachers are teachers of color. And a recent NCS report from the 17-18 school year found that about 79% of public school teachers identified as white. In comparison, only about 9% of teachers identified as Hispanic, and only about 7% of teachers identified as Black. And about 2% of teachers identified as Asian, and less than 1% identified as Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander or American Indian Alaskan Native. In contrast, our student population is much more diverse and continues to grow more so. Public school enrollments are projected to be higher in 2028, which is not too far away, for Black students, Hispanic students, Asian Pacific Islanders, and students of 2 or more races. Enrollment is projected actually to be lower for white students. The diversity of our students and educators is valuable to our education system. Students and educators' cultural, linguistic, and racial diversity really enhances creativity, innovation, and problem solving in the classroom. Groups of more diverse problem solvers have been found to outperform groups of less diverse problem solvers. And companies with more diversity in their leadership also tend to be top financial performers. So research shows that diversity in schools, including racial diversity among teachers, can provide significant benefits to our students. And here to help us with all of this great work to understand the research and policy impact is Constance Lindsay from the University of North Carolina as an assistant professor, and Kate Walsh, who's the president of the Council on Teacher Equality. Now, Constance and Kate brings insights into research and data and evidence, but also expertise in the policy world about how to translate that policy, how to translate that research into action. Now, Kate has joined us before and offered pragmatic advice on how states can take evidence-based action steps to further issues of teacher equality within their states. And Constance has some really interesting research that I'm excited to be able to share with you all. So welcome, Constance and Kate. Really appreciate you joining us today. I'm going to kick it off to Kate with the first question. Now, yesterday, Kate, we had our new member institute for all board members who were newly elected or appointed within the past year. So if you're a new member coming to the state board meeting for the first time, what's essential that you know about the benefits to a diverse teacher workforce?
Well, the research is really conclusive and it's dramatic and it's important. And it is something that every school board in the country, every state agency is trying to grapple with. The problem is there are fundamental problems with demographics that have to be acknowledged and that every school member ought to know. 51% of all kids who are in school right now are Black and brown, but only 20% of adults are Black and brown. So there's a demographic challenge there that automatically handicaps our efforts. And then we get to the fact that Black and brown teacher candidates have not had equal, Black and brown high school students do not have equal access to college and are often the victims of systemic racism where they are not able to finish college at the rate that white students have. So there are a lot of challenges to this very pipeline. And I think the most important thing that I would like to convey to new board members is that the one mistake that is likely, and I'm sorry, I'm driving in an RV, so it's a little rocky. I'm on my way back from a 5-week trip out west, and
oh, there you go.
As I was, okay.
You might be on mute. You're coming in and out. So keep going, and then I may click you off mute, and then we'll see what we can do here for a little bit.
Okay. I don't know why.
You're good now.
Am I good now?
Mm-hmm.
That was happening to you as well, right?
I know.
In and out.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. But thank you for bearing with us.
Okay, no, that's the problem. I was saying I'm in an RV, so I'm moving along here on a 5-week trip out west, and I'm almost back to Maryland. It's a little bit challenging to do this call from an RV, let me tell you. But the most important is how to balance these two competing goals of teacher quality and teacher diversity. And the one thing I'm very concerned about is when folks, the only thing they might pay attention to is one or the other. And that's just a false dichotomy, which I'd like to address as we get into this.
Thank you, Kate. That's great advice for our new board members and our veteran board members. Constance, I wanted to turn to you to have a conversation about your research that looks at not just the academic benefits for students and students of color, but also delved into looking at some exclusionary discipline rates when Black students were matched with the same race teacher. Can you talk a little bit about what you found with regards to discipline and referral?
Sure. So we have a 2017 study that there's actually two versions of it. So there's one that's in the Educational Evaluation and Policy Archives, which is an academic journal. And then there's a more accessible version that's actually in EdNext, which is super accessible. So if you have board members who are interested in reading it, I would encourage you to find it. It's a study I have with my colleague, Cassie Hart, who's out at UC Davis. And basically what we do is we take data from North Carolina over 5 years, and we use some methods to basically analyze what happens for Black students when they have a Black teacher. And in particular, looking at this outcome of exclusionary discipline. And so one of the things that we find is that we find not huge, but consistent effects of having a same race teacher for Black students on exclusionary discipline, right? And so I don't have to tell everybody here what exclusionary discipline is, right? This is when you get taken out of the classroom you're not able to receive instruction. And, if you sort of go down along the line, you could sort of think about it as this beginning to the school to prison pipeline. And so what's interesting is that we find even for controlling for things like whether the student is on free and reduced price lunch, whether they're in a suburban setting or an urban setting, the results are pretty consistent. And so we think that's, there's a sort of a cottage industry of these papers out now, but we think that it's strong evidence that shows that, in particular for Black students, and we can come back and talk about the research based for Latinx students, but in particular for Black students, having a Black teacher does lower their rates of things like exclusionary discipline. And I think in the EdNext version, we actually show that it's also not harmful for white students to have a Black teacher as well.
Constance, I wanted to follow up with one question too, if you don't mind, because I think it's just good to set the stage for this about the the academic benefits for all kids. And we talked about the discipline aspects too. But one aspect too is that this is not just a short-term benefit, but it has a long-term benefit too. And some of your research looked at college aspiration and the impact of the positive impact upon college aspirations, particularly for students of color. Could you share with board members your research around that?
Sure. So this is a 2018 study that's also available and is open access via the MBER website. So if you Google it, it's the long run impacts of same race teachers. And basically what we find there is also using data from North Carolina and Tennessee that for younger Black students, so elementary age, and then elementary age in North Carolina, and kindergarten, first grade in Tennessee, that having a Black teacher in those early grades is related to things like lowered high school dropout rates. And then also in Tennessee, we're able to see that some of the students actually enroll in community college at higher rates if they've had those experiences early on. And what's interesting is that in both cases, so if you've ever sort of heard this one Black teacher paper quoted in the media, that's what they're talking about. But there's some important nuances I want to bring up because I think it'll be helpful for our discussion. So, so in both cases, the results are driven by persistently low income young Black boys. And so those are the students who are most disadvantaged. And in particular, those students who do not have a college educated parent at home. So they are more likely to say, they're less likely to drop out of high school and more likely to, in the North Carolina case, say that they're going to attend college. And in the Tennessee case, actually enroll in college. And so we have all this evidence about short run stuff like test scores, discipline, placement in gifted status, pretty much anything you could put on the left-hand side, unfortunately. But then this is the first paper to kind of show that there's this long run effect, which I think is also super helpful for us as we start to think about the why. Why do we see some of these impacts, which I'm sure we'll get to in the discussion.
Excellent. So I wanted to turn to a topic, but I promise we're going to come back to that diversity question too, about that quality and diversity too, because it's important to get into. I just want to address something that I think is immediately on people's minds too. States are making some short-term adjustments to the way that they're looking at teacher certification and preparation in light of the pandemic. And I wanted to make sure our members had some tools to think about in terms of how to evaluate those short-term temporary changes so that they can balance whether or not that short-term temporary change has that short-term benefit, but does it have some maybe unintended longer-term consequences they should be thinking about? And is there data that they should look at? Or is there pitfalls that they should make sure that they avoid? Kate, why don't we start with you and then we'll go to Constance on that.
You're talking short.
So Kate, I'm having a problem hearing you.
Are you talking about short-term benefits in terms of what?
No, that's a great question too. So let's maybe look at some states that are looking at their policies to make sure that they have a number of teachers in the classroom during the pandemic. So a number of states are wrestling with what I look at as terms of perceived teacher shortages in light of the pandemic, as teachers are making decisions to return or not to return to the classroom, and making adjustments to their certification protocols, their substitute teaching requirements, the ways that they're supporting teachers through the teacher the student teaching experience. Now, some of those have been kind of relaxing standards to get more folks into the classroom, which, does have the immediate benefit of having more students and more people in that classroom, but also may have some negative consequences in the longer term areas too. And so I was hoping that we could maybe give some states some questions or considerations they should think about as they look at this immediate, urgent, temporary need, and what's the impact upon the longer term consequences for folks.
Well, we're going to find all those answers out, right? But right now we have to deal with what we've got to deal with. There's no question that kids are getting shortchanged in this pandemic, but aren't we all? And I'm just not. I don't know. I don't know what to say about it because we don't have any other option. If we did, we'd be pursuing it. It would be great if kids were back in school full time. It would be great if we hadn't had to drop all certification requirements for teachers to get them into the profession. It would be great if we didn't have to have force, let people in without doing their student teaching. All those things are losses to teacher quality and to kids. And I think that the only solution here is to look forward and to keep measuring. The one thing that I feel very strongly about is if we stop measuring what's going on in these classrooms, we will absolutely be the worst for it.
Excellent. Thank you for that point about constantly evaluating, gathering data about what is the impact these decisions are having. And we won't know unless we have an evaluation plan in place. Constance, you're a researcher. So I'm just going to toss this to you a little bit and say, what would you like to see state boards monitoring and evaluating as they make these decisions?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot there. So a few things. So I always like to think of this teacher diversity stuff as just sort of one spoke of the umbrella of all the challenges that face the teaching profession, right? And so everything that COVID is doing to the teaching profession is going to be sort of felt harder by teachers of color and, those of us who are sort of trying to work on some of these issues. So when it comes to sort of this short-term, long-term thing, so I'll echo Kate and say, I think the best thing is collecting data. I think also when we start to have to make very hard decisions, I think we know enough now from the research base that, for example, if there's layoffs or if there's different plans that we're going to undertake, we have the ability to kind of simulate and see how particular groups might be hit harder. So for example, if there's policies that say that, novice teachers have to go first or whatever the case may be, you have the ability to figure out how that's going to impact your teachers of color before you sort of commit to a particular plan. So the other thing I'll say too is that I also like to think about this as sort of the human capital continuum, right? And sort of the prep and licensure piece is sort of one chunk of this. And I think there are certain things that serve as ways to exclude people from the classroom that aren't necessarily related to later effectiveness. So we don't actually know the direction that some of this stuff might go in. And so it would be nice to sort of see what actually does matter in terms of what makes an effective teacher, right? And some of that will have some natural experiments due to COVID that we might be able to offer some more, to shed some light on some of these challenges.
Excellent, thank you. Now to tee us up for that conversation about diversity and equality, Kate, can you share with us some of the potential barriers that are in place that may exist? And NASBE, we like to talk about how policy sometimes isn't just an add-on to solve a problem. It's about really looking at policies that are on the books that potentially may need to be removed or revised in order to eliminate barriers in the pipeline too. So can you talk a little bit about any barriers that might be either in traditional or alternative teacher preparation pathways for getting students of color to become teachers of color?
Well, the biggest barrier is the fact that we don't educate Black and brown kids as well as white kids for the most part, because of the way our educational system is set up. That's the biggest barrier. And so a lot of times Black and brown kids get to college and they struggle. But what I'm most concerned about is the trend that says, okay, so these kids are struggling. So the answer is to get rid of the tests that would put a number to how much they're struggling, which would prevent them from getting into teaching. I think that's unfair to the teacher candidate, even if it does mean that they could become a teacher when they otherwise might not, but it's mostly unfair to kids. So there's a strong trend in the United States right now is to shoot the messenger, is to say, well, Black and brown kids, teacher candidates, prospects are not passing their licensing tests. So therefore, let's get rid of the licensing tests. I'm not here to defend the quality of licensing tests. I am here to say that they measure how much a teacher knows, and that knowledge is determined to be critical for we have never questioned up until recently that teachers ought to know their content. And all of a sudden that has been thrown into, that's very disturbing trend. The real problem isn't that these kids can't pass their licensing test. The real problem is that teacher preparation programs are not properly preparing them. They're not guiding them to the coursework that would allow them to be successful in these tests. They hand them cram booklets rather than give them coursework that would allow them to be successful. So I think that the real focus of state boards ought to be on what teacher preparation programs are not doing vis-a-vis their candidates, but especially candidates of color.
Thank you, Kate. I love how you cut right through to it. Love that. Thank you so much. Constance, I want to turn to you because you've also raised this issue earlier on too. And one of the things I want to pose to you, but also definitely feel free to dive off of Kate's comments too, is when we talk about licensure exams, sometimes that's when board members are faced with that question about quality versus diversity. And we at NASBE don't believe those are mutually exclusive goals, right? There's a way to lift both up.
Yes.
So talk to me about how a board member can change that conversation, either through specific actions or just guidance and help and communication around those.
Yeah, so yeah, that's great. My colleagues and I actually have a book coming out in February 2021 about teacher representation, diversity, policy suggestions and all that stuff. But we do make this argument that teacher diversity is teacher quality, right? So, which is relatively radical now, I guess. I mean, I think we're evolving to get there. So I would say a few things. So I do agree that one of our largest challenges is that we just don't have enough Black and brown college graduates, right? And so everyone in every industry is fighting over the same limited pool of BA holders. I also think that teacher prep programs could do more to expand the pipeline of students of color. And so I was at the Urban Institute prior to coming to UNC, and we have a data visualization that basically shows that our nation's minority serving institutions are doing more than their fair share of producing teachers of color. And so to the licensure question, I don't think that we have to sort of have this trade-off, right? I think we can expand the pipeline. I think that, but again, we need to make sure that whatever we're using as a tool to bring folks into the profession or weed them out or whatever the case may be, if it's actually related to teacher effectiveness, then it can stay. If it's something that just serves to keep people out and is not related to eventual effectiveness, then I think that doesn't make much sense given what we know now. So that's sort of where I would land on that. But no, I think it's a false dichotomy to say that teacher diversity is not teacher quality, and then we find ourselves in a trick bag. The other thing I'll say too, even though I am at a school of education, is that we don't have the numbers of diverse candidates to even choose from, because the schools of ed themselves are not super diverse. The faculties are not diverse. Very often students of color want to pursue a social justice mission if they're going to get into teaching at all. And so if you don't see that reflected in the curriculum, you're not going to be attracted to it. And so what we do find is that many of these students of color who do end up in the classroom go through alternative route programs. And I think those alternative routes and grow your owns can be very useful models for how we think about how to do this teacher prep with this eye for diversity in mind. So I'll stop there.
So Constance, you want to stop there, but I'm going to push you a little bit more,
Okay.
and then I promise to come back to Kate.
Well, I'm trying to toe a little bit of a line.
I appreciate that. But you just had two ideas. You touched on alternative certification programs and grow your own programs. So I'm just going to pose a question for you about specific actions you'd like to see a state board take. So if this is an area of opportunity to widen that pipeline for supporting increasing diversity in our educator workforce, if you were a state board member or advising a state board member, what would you like to see either as an action item that they're taking, or a piece of discussion or a question that they would like to ask at their next board meeting?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. So one, I think we need to infuse equity as a part of standards, training, etc. One way to do that is through something like a grow your own program that is focused on equity, right? Because the other piece too is that we aren't going to have the numbers of diverse teachers that we want anytime soon. So we do have to address sort of just training everyone to be able to work with all types of kids. And I know that, many districts are focused on, they're starting equity offices and they're thinking about equity. And I know I don't even know that people know what we're talking about when we say equity. So there's a lot of stuff to figure out there. But I think really focusing on just making equity a part of the standards, the way you hold people accountable for other things, they should be held accountable for their equity orientations as well. So I would say that's a piece of it. And then what was the second part that you asked me?
So if there are any specific actions or questions or discussion items that you'd like to see on the state board agenda.
So so for the state boards, I would focus on really having an equity statement and really figuring out how that's going to be infused into all of the things that you are doing. How is it infused into the teacher evaluation system? How is it infused to how people are prepared? And what are the ways that you can hold yourself accountable for making sure that people are engaging in sort of equity-focused actions?
Thank you so much for that. I know that there are a couple of state board meetings, state board members who are on this session that actually have worked on equity statements, and you just gave them some great actionable advice. Kate, I want to turn to you. I'm going to pose a question, but feel free to round about and answer it in a different way if you want to. One of the comments that you made about that importance of teacher preparation programs, right? And about supporting students and the specific content necessary for them to be successful as a teacher and successful potentially on their licensure exams, but most importantly, to be successful as a teacher. A lot of state boards have authority over their teacher preparation programs. What guidance would you give to them to either review and look at this, or to change it, or to work closely with higher education institutions? You're great in giving concrete, practical advice. So what advice would you give a state board member that wants to take this on?
I think that there's a couple different things that are important for state board members to recognize. That is, when programs are not successfully graduating their candidates, so they may take in high numbers of Black and Latino students, but then graduate very few of them. And so you need to look at pass rates. That's something our organization is going to be publishing. We have pass rate data for 30 some states. Why is that important? Because these folks are being admitted into programs and being told, you pay tuition, you spend a few years doing this and you will become a teacher. And in some institutions, large numbers are not graduating. And they graduate from college, but they don't graduate with a teaching degree because they can't complete the state licensing test. And so when board members or whoever confronts that data, they realize there are some institutions that are somehow doing a really good job getting their candidates ready and others that aren't. But unfortunately, there are almost no states in this country which use that data to hold programs accountable. Now, I do want to get into this issue of well, we're not saying content knowledge isn't important. We're just saying these tests are flawed. And so some states are saying, well, if the tests are flawed, then we're just going to abandon them. And what they're not doing is putting anything in their place. So the one area where I might disagree with my colleague is that teacher diversity absolutely benefits students, and not just Black and brown students, but all students. And but still, there are qualifications apart from one's culture that are essential. It doesn't matter if a teacher is Black, brown, purple, or red. If they don't know any math, they shouldn't be teaching math. And if they don't know any history or geography or science, that has really bad ramifications for children's reading ability. Even if there isn't a history class in the school, children need to have their knowledge built, especially children who have not had access. So to discard the importance of these things, and I get that people are saying they're not discarding the importance of content knowledge, but there is no other way to measure it. You cannot measure content knowledge through a performance assessment. The performance assessments that are out there are ones where the teacher picks a topic they want to teach. And so if they don't know anything about fractions, they'll teach addition. Nobody is testing whether or not they know any fractions. So I just think it's a lot more complicated and nuanced. And the last point I would leave with you on this is all of the studies showing the importance of teacher diversity were completed on teachers who had passed their licensing tests, who had met the state standards of the state. So when states talk about walking away from their standards because of the teacher diversity research, they're not recognizing the fact that those were teachers who met a standard, and that behooves us to keep the standard.
Excellent. Thank you, Kate. Really appreciate it. Constance, did you want to react to anything of that add on?
Yeah. So I don't disagree about the content knowledge. I guess I was more so speaking to things that might exclude people from even getting in the pipeline that we know that aren't related to eventual effectiveness. But I think it is a totally valid point that every study that I've ever conducted is on licensed and certified teachers. So yeah, I'll stop there.
But I think what we've seen states do is to drop the basic skills test. Because the basic skills test tests whether someone can read, perform the math needed to be a teacher, and some writing skills. And it's not a particularly hard test, but there is a high rate of failure among Black and brown students, which is a reflection of systemic racism. Mm-hmm. But how do we end it is not to lower standards. We have to address the program. If they want to take students into their program who don't have those skills, they're going to have to figure out how to get those young teachers to acquire those skills. It is not going to solve this country's horrible legacy of racism to put teachers in a classroom who lack basic skills.
Sure. And so that's again where I'd say it's on the teacher prep program, right? So so I guess what I'm arguing is more of a not thinking about ways to exclude people, but really making it the responsibility of the teacher prep programs to get people up to speed. So you should offer support to pass, I know it's not the practice anymore, but you should offer support for things like that if students can't pass that to get in to the program.
Yeah. We've got a study, and I'm not supposed to talk about it because it's not going to come out until midwinter, but we look at the diversity of teacher prep programs across the United States. And we look at the intersection of the diversity and whether they're sufficiently selective. And I don't mean, are they like Harvard? I just mean they take the top half of college-going population, which is lower than the international standard. In other countries, we see them taking the top third. So we say, let's just do the top half, all right? And we look at that intersection. There are more programs, there are 3 times as many programs which are both selective and diverse as there are programs that are neither. So we hope we can dispel the myth that the only way to attract Black and brown prospects into teaching is to lower standards. The truth of the matter is far fewer Black students consider teaching than white students per percentage.
Yeah.
It's if you we estimate that if as many Black students considered teaching, Black and brown students considered teaching as white kids, you'd get 80,000 more teachers a year into the profession. So why is it that they don't want to teach? There's lots of different reasons, but one of them is they didn't have a very good experience in their K-12 education, so they don't want to go back into schools. A lot of discipline, they were disproportionately disciplined. Then they are often first-generation college goers. Their parents say to them, you are not going to college and coming out and being a teacher. You're going to go and make some money. They may be saddled with debt. So what I'm going to give, I want to put one idea on the table. The one thing that a state board or a state legislature could do tomorrow to improve the number of candidates who come out of these programs is to require the program to pay fees to retake these licensing tests if they fail the first time. Make programs own these tests, because right now the dominant viewpoint on these campuses is that these are just tests that the state makes you take. We don't own them. We don't believe them. They're multiple choice. You shouldn't, we don't believe in them. Just go take them. Here's a cram booklet. You'll be okay. And you'll take it 2, 3, 4, 5 times, and you'll pass eventually. Well, that costs a fortune. So we need, if you look at nursing, they have an 86% pass rate on the first attempt of their boards. In elementary teachers, it's 46%.
That's powerful advice, Kate. I like how you're really pragmatic and get to the point there. But Constance, I want to transition to you. In your comments when we initially raised this issue about how state boards could address that kind of dichotomy, or lack of a dichotomy should be, between diversity and quality, you talked about that importance of equity, setting that state definition of equity and infusing it in all the policy decisions. I want to transition us a little bit over to retention of teachers of color and about that equity kind of infusion in policy and practice and what happens in the school building, specifically around how a school leader can support teachers of color within their school and what a state can do to help support a school leader that has teachers of color in the school. And ideally, that school leader is a person of color as well. So Constance, it's rather a big question, but I'm going to toss it to you.
Okay. All right. So I have a few things. So one, we just released a working paper where we're looking at turnover rates for Black teachers when they're matched to a Black principal. And basically find that that gap in turnover doesn't go away, but it's mitigated if you do have a leader of color, even controlling for what we know are the more challenging, very often the more challenging working conditions faced by Black teachers. And actually that paper does cover teachers of color, sort of Latinx and Black teachers as well. So I think that there are a few things. So state boards of ed can look at things like how their teachers are dispersed around the district, right? Are all the teachers of color sort of clustered at high needs and hard to staff schools that have difficult working conditions? And of course, you can't sort of just force people to move, but that sort of can serve a bunch of different purposes. So one, to sort of think about how those working conditions might be disproportionately impacting Black and Brown teachers. Two, it can also sort of help with these short-term challenges of making sure more kids are exposed to more diverse sets of teachers. Um, so so the retention piece is, I think it is complicated, but most of what I read really focuses on this idea of these differences in working conditions. There's a researcher named Travis Bristol, who's at UC Berkeley, who has some really nice work on, well, he has a few papers, but he has some really nice pieces on what happens when you're the only Black teacher in a school, or what happens to Black men who might be promoted to be like the disciplinarian, but then they don't get the opportunity to develop into a leader because they're not exposed to other, types of challenges. And so I think it's a complicated question. And so it just would depend on, where the board wants to put its energy in. And so is it into the principal pipeline and thinking about training leaders appropriately for these situations, growing, some sort of cohort model that gives people, the ability to sort of talk to folks who are dealing with these types of things. So yeah, so I still think of it in that sort of continuum and thinking about, where you want to intervene kind of depending on what your local context might be.
But can I just want to underscore one point. When you look at all the places in the pipeline where we lose opportunities to get candidates of color, teachers of color, it's not actually, the problem is not as much who goes into college, but who graduates from college. That's a huge loss. Who will consider teaching major? That's a huge difference. Retention we do leak. The pipeline does leak at retention, but it is not the big payout. It is not yes, you see a small difference between the retention of white teachers over Black teachers, but I'm a little concerned about the national conversation. I don't think, Connie, you were saying this. It's been my observation that a lot of people think if we just figure out how to retain Black teachers, we're going to have all of a sudden a lot more Black teachers, and we're not. It's not that big of a difference between the retention rate. So I would caution school boards from thinking that that's going to be a big payout.
Yeah, and I would say, yeah, definitely. If you said, okay, we have limited resources and we want bang for the buck, it's the expansion of the pipeline for sure.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
Well, both of you, thank you. I just looked at the clock and we have about 9 minutes left. So I have a short question for each of you. And then there are a couple of questions in the audience that I hope I want to get to. So let's see, Constance, I'm going to pitch this one to you. And I have to say, I'm going to give a little context for this question. And that's that sometimes during this pandemic environment, and when we look at the persistence of this particular issue, it can get a little hard to deal with. It's a persistent and pernicious issue that we're struggling with. But your paper had this line that gave me a lot of hope in it too. I'm going to look down to read it to make sure I got it right too. It says that work shows that stubbornly persistent attainment gaps are not impervious to policy changes. So what would you like to see on a state board agenda that gives you hope that state boards have the knowledge, the capacity, the will, the courage to take on this issue? What would you be looking for at their next meeting?
At their next meeting, okay. Well, and I've testified to some state boards of ed about some of this stuff. So one, I think the short-term thing is that distribution piece, right? And also, again, so let's go back to this concept of like bang for your buck. If you have students in your district who are particularly disadvantaged, who don't have exposure to teachers that look like them, that might be a place to start. So one of the things that I found kind of surprising in the North Carolina data is that over half the Black kids never had a Black teacher, right? And so I might look at my data to see sort of who's where and who on the margin might benefit just from having that exposure. And that's not a long-term thing, but it's a short-term thing you can do in terms of thinking about where people are located and who they're exposed to. So I might focus on that. Yeah, and then I would say just keep having the conversations about equity and really, you know, and I think one of the things, it's a project, I'm talking around this because it's something that I'm working on that I can't say exactly what it is right now, but the thing about equity is that there's stages, right? And so you have to think about where your board and district is and state is in terms of sort of the stages, right? Because you start off just thinking about representation, then you have to get all the way over to like social justice and anti-racism, right? And so you could easily start off with representation. That's just your data. That's who do you have? That's how can you shift things around? And that's a good place to start to open up the conversation that people are more comfortable with. And then you can really get into like, what are the actions that show that we are an equity-oriented district or state or whatever the case may be.
Thank you, Constance. So Kate, a kind of same question to you, but maybe a little bit nuanced and different. So what is that one action item that you'd like to see on a board agenda immediately based upon your recommendations? But I also want you to add on to that and say, when you look 1 year from now, what are you looking for in terms of signals that you know a board has continued to be successful on this issue? Kate, I have you as muted right now.
Sorry. Yeah. I think I've already addressed what I think is the top line recommendation, and that is that they start looking at pass rates, and they do so fairly and not a way that will penalize. You know, I'm not interested in looking at pass rates of Stanford versus, you know, a school that's not as selective. What we're going to be doing is reporting pass rates so that institutions can see how they compare to institutions that look like them. And that's what boards need to do. And the answer should not be, okay, the pass rates are really low, let's get rid of the tests. I mean, you can always go through a process where you look at these tests again and make sure they are what you want them to be. But I think that they are of paramount importance. That would be a mistake for boards to consider dropping them. You know, we absolutely do need to hold programs accountable. I will tell you, we have looked at the coursework that is required in 1,250 institutions. And there's really a strong connection between what elementary teachers need to know to be successful in the classroom and what the courses that they take to get there. So it is no wonder that so many kids, I mean, and that just doesn't happen in nursing. You know, there's no question in nursing that they are you know, prepared to take their boards. And that a similar approach has to be taken within teacher prep. They have to stop bad-mouthing the tests. If the tests are bad, let's make them better. But no matter what, the outcome must be that programs take ownership for preparing candidates to do well on those tests.
So 1 year from now, we're seeing programs work together to have ownership over those tests, improvements in those assessments, but a true commitment to making sure we're preparing our students for quality and content.
Do you know that most of these programs, most states don't publish these pass rates? The programs don't even know their pass rates. The state didn't even know their pass rates until we asked them to ask for it from their publishers. These are a secret, and you know, they get these fictional Title II data, which just reports program completion, which is anyone who didn't fail the test. It's completely unhelpful. So this will be the first time we've actually seen actual pass rates. Good data drives good decision making.
All right, I just have to end it right there because I love data and I believe strongly in the power of good data to drive good decision making. And we're almost at time, and I think the session cuts off right at 3:30. And I want to make sure that I can give you a couple blurbs for our attendees. But first, let me say thank you so much to Constance and Kate, both for bearing with us through our technical
Thank you.
glitches, but
No
also
worries.
for the great content you provided our members. Really appreciate you sharing your insights with us. Thank you.
My
And
pleasure.
thank you. I do want to let our participants know two things. One is we have a break next. Our next session is at 4 o'clock, and you have a choice to dive into assessment and accountability issues during the pandemic, or to dive into our digital divide too, and look at some innovations therein. That's at 4 o'clock. And after we wrap up the session, there will be a button that shows up that says rate this session. This is our evaluation tool. And as Kate said, and as Constance has said, data helps us make good decisions. So please tell us what we can do better, what you liked about the session, so we can improve our conferences to meet your needs in years to come. Again, thank you so much for participating in all your work. And with that, we'll go ahead and conclude our session. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.